What do you look for in a crime fiction festival? Bestsellers? Prize winners? A new favourite crime writer? At Gwyl Crime Cymru Festival in spring 2023, we'll be offering all of these. But much, much more will be available. Because the home of our festival is Aberystwyth, a little town with a long history and a big heart. Once home to Welsh princes, Aberystwyth is now home to the National Library of Wales and Aberystwyth University. The sweep of the town's Regency seafront pulls the tourists in from around the globe. Aberystwyth even offers the chance to watch dolphins as well as crime writers. Festival goers will be able to enjoy gourmet food and drink, as well as delectable discussions of murder, mystery and mayhem. You'll find live music in warm, welcoming pubs, as well as lively discussions on our festival stage in a former music hall theatre, with plenty of authors around for lively discussions of your own. Come and get cosy with the crime. There are hidden alleys and ancient byways to explore where murders might quite easily be hidden, and a funicular railway to take you to the top of Constitution Hill, where you can enjoy the Camera Obscura. And if you stay for a few days after the festival, you will be able to enjoy the breathtaking scenery of Ceredigion. The countryside and coast can be viewed by boat or heritage train, on foot and two wheels as well as four. Whether you love exploring lush river valleys, walking unspoiled beaches, or discovering the history of this beautiful area, Aberystwyth and Ceredigion have so much to offer. So come to Gwyl Crime Cymru Festival next spring. You might just discover your new favourite crime writer, as well as your new favourite town.
Noswaith dda pawb, a chroeso i'r digwyddiad Crime Cymru hwn. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Crime Cymru Festival event. All festivals need financial support, and we're very grateful for Aberystwyth Town Council and Literature Wales, who've made it possible for us to present the festival online this year. So big thanks to them for their vision and their generosity. One of the things the Crime Cymru Author Collective was set up to do was to promote new Welsh writing. So at the beginning of every festival event, we're running 5-minute slots, which we're calling Crime Close-Up, to introduce new Crime Cymru members. The Crime Cymru Close-Up author for this particular event is Leslie Scase, so I'll let him introduce himself. Over to you, Leslie.
Hello, good evening to you all. My name's Leslie Scase, and I'm the author of the Inspector Chard Mysteries, and this is my latest novel, which was published last year by Seren Books. Fatal Solution is a murder mystery set in the late 19th century. It's a tale of greed, lust and revenge, set against a backdrop of a real mining disaster and the rivalry of two railway companies. The central character, Inspector Chard, is investigating a mysterious death following a fire, when two men are poisoned elsewhere in the town, causing a general panic. A number of sexual assaults complicate matters further. Can Chard untangle a web of deceit and find the killer? In terms of genre, my Chard books have been described as Ripper Street meets Alexander Cordell. I'd like to think there's a touch of Agatha Christie in there as well. If you'd like to find out more, then please just search for Leslie Scase on Facebook or for Inspector Chard on Twitter. The reading I'm about to give finds Chard at the mortuary for a meeting with Dr. Ezekiel Matthews. A Sunday morning, a bloody Sunday morning. Do you not have any respect for a man's day of rest, Thomas? Sorry, Ezekiel, apologised Chard, quite taken aback. I had a fine evening's entertainment. Then I come home to find one of your men waiting for me, demanding that I come here this morning. It's just not on, Thomas. As I said, Ezekiel, I'm sorry. I didn't think you'd be so annoyed. Annoyed? Annoyed, he repeated. Yes, I'm bloody well annoyed. And do you know why I'm annoyed? Because I've interrupted your Sunday morning? Partly because of that, but mainly because I don't know what I'm dealing with here, replied the doctor, his nose twitching furiously. How do you mean? Come closer, Thomas. It's only a dead body. It can't hurt you. Chard felt his stomach churn as he approached the table. The cadaver had been cut open to reveal the inner organs, at least those that hadn't already been lifted out and put into the large glass bowl. I know the cause of death, respiratory paralysis. What I don't know is what caused it, as well as the evident effect on the digestive system and some apparent damage to the heart. Is it some kind of disease? Not one that I've come across that can suddenly take 2 men down in such a short space of time. Potentially, it's a case of poison, but if so, I can't find any evidence of it. There are no obvious symptoms of arsenic or cyanide poisoning. Of that, I'm confident. What can I do? Asked the inspector, starting to feel worried at the enormity of the problem that was now presenting itself. If it is a disease, then the chances are there will be more fatalities and fairly soon, so I'll put the hospital on alert. If it is a poison, then we need to know if these men were specifically poisoned or if there's a wider risk to the population. Find out where this man and the survivor spent their time in the few hours before they were taken ill, demanded the doctor. Few hours? Surely poison of this severity would be fast acting. Not necessarily. It depends on what was used, if indeed it is a poison. The doctor pointed to some glass jars on a shelf. I've taken samples of their vomit and excreta for analysis. I'll question the man in the infirmary as soon as Dr. Henderson will allow, said Chard. I wouldn't count on him being in a fit state to be questioned for a few days. That is if he pulls through, cautioned Matthews. In which case, we'll have to do it the hard way. We know that Mr. Clark was meeting the poor chap on your table at the Butcher's Arms, so that's where we'll start. I'll get my constables on it straight away. The inspector turned to leave, but as he did so, he glanced at the face of the cadaver and then paused. I've seen that man before, and recently at that. Where? Asked the doctor. I don't know. According to Dr. Henderson, there were papers on him that indicated he was a Jeremiah Davis, but the name means nothing to me. I think I'll ask Dr. Henderson if I can see the man Clark in case I recognize him also. A few minutes later, the inspector stood by the doorway of the makeshift isolation room in the infirmary and stared at the face of the unconscious man on the bed. Then recognition came. There we go. That's the end.
Thanks, Leslie. That was amazing. Yeah. I hope that's whetted lots of people's appetites to go away and read the Inspector Chard mysteries. Thanks. And now to the main event. How much fact? How much fiction? I should just say before we introduce our panelists that we'd love to hear from you, our audience. So please do pop your questions in the chat function, and Louise Mumford, our Crime Cymru co-chair, will womble them up and ask them on your behalf a bit later. So, to our stars for the night. Vaseem Khan is one of those writers who just refused to give up. After what he estimates to be more than 200 rejections of his early work, he found success in 2015 with the first of a crime series set in contemporary Mumbai, The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra, featuring the most unusual sidekick in crime fiction, a baby elephant. In more recent times, Vas has switched his fiction from modern-day Mumbai to post-partition Bombay with his Inspector Persis Wadia series, and he's currently the CWA historical dagger holder for the first in that series, Midnight at Malabar House. The second in the series, The Dying Day, is now out in paperback. Vaseem is also one of the dynamic duo that bring us the brilliant Red Hot Chili Writers podcast every fortnight with his co-presenter, Abir Mukherjee. Welcome, Vas.
Thank you, Alice, for that very glowing and possibly slightly inaccurate introduction. You make me sound a lot nicer than my wife thinks I am.
You're very nice. I've met you on a couple of occasions and I listen to your podcast all the time, and I am quite convinced that you're an extremely nice man, and I will not be told otherwise. And our other panelist, Chris Lloyd, has also turned from writing contemporary crime fiction to historical. His fascinating Catalan crime thriller series, featuring Elisenda Domenech, We're set in modern-day Girona in Catalonia, where Chris lived for many years as a teacher, writer, and translator. But his books have now moved to Second World War Paris for his Eddie Giral series. The first in the series, The Unwanted Dead, is set in the first days of the Nazi occupation of Paris, and it won Chris this year's Historical Writers Association's Gold Crown. The second in the series, Paris Requiem, is scheduled to be published later this year. Welcome, Chris.
Hi everyone. Hi Alice. Hi Class.
Hey Chris.
I must admit, it's wonderful to be in the company of two historical crime writers whose books I absolutely love. And that's not a word of a lie. I asked to be the chair of this panel because I just couldn't resist.
Just couldn't get out of it.
Blatant self-favoritism.
Oh, what did you do wrong, Alice? Before we go any further, huge congratulations to you, Alice, for your long listing.
Absolutely.
For the Historical Dagger Award.
Thank you. I must confess, I am massively chuffed. Thank you very much. It's it makes me feel slightly less overawed by your gold crown and your historical dagger. But anyway, listen, I know, Vas, that there are going to be tons of people in the audience who are trying to get their first novels published at the moment, and I wonder how many of them were horrified to hear that you had more than 200 rejections to your name.
Well, I mean, that's okay, so it's not quite as bad as you think, because I wrote my first novel when I was 17. I was reading Terry Pratchett. It's a wonderful Discworld series, and I thought, this looks easy. And I wrote a comic sci-fi fantasy. I finished it, and then I went to my parents, and I said, I'm not going to university. I'm going to be a rich and famous writer. So you can imagine what Asian parents thought of that particular idea. Anyway, I sent it off, and there was one small problem with my cunning plan, which was that the book was shit. So ultimately, it took another 20 odd years. And, every few years I would finish a book and I would send it out to lots and lots of agents. And, as time goes by, you get better. You get better at these things if you continuously write, edit, read, until you get to a point where your writing is good enough. And then it's just getting an idea that hits the right agent at the right time. So for all of those people who are in the audience, who are in that place where maybe you've finished a novel or you've not quite finished it, you're wondering how to finish it, or you're disappointed because you've had rejections, it's not just a question of don't give up. It's a question of you've got to keep exercising those muscles. You've got to keep writing every day. You've got to keep going to the point where the quality of your writing is publishable. That's the first barrier. And 90% of rejections happen because people cannot meet that barrier. They haven't written for long enough and gotten good enough at writing so that publishers can see this book on a bookshelf. And after that, it's really about coming up with an idea that hopefully with a bit of luck finds the right agent.
And was that sense that you were getting better all the time what kept you going, even in the face of continuous rejection?
I think when you're 17, you have no self-awareness. You think you're the bee's knees and the rest of it, but you're not. But as you get older and a bit of humility kicks in, especially when you start plastering your bedroom with rejections. But over time, what happened was, I think maybe my fourth novel, a decade later, where the rejection started to go from go throw yourself off a cliff, you're rubbish, to we like your writing. This idea is not for us, but send us your next book. And those small bits of encouragement are what you really need to keep going. The thing is, you have to remember, I started in a era where there was no internet. There were no groups that you could join up with and bounce ideas off. So I had no feedback whatsoever for 2 decades.
Chris, were you similar? Did you start very early?
Yes, and sort of on and off. I wrote my first things when I was about 10, and I turned them into my teacher and said, well, that's all very well, but you're supposed to write an essay on something completely different. But I sort of went in through a side door, because as you said, I lived in Girona in Catalonia, and I read a rough guide about Girona, the city where I lived, and it was awful. And so I wrote to them and said, this is dreadful, I could do much better. And they sent me a lot of money and said, well, go on, then do it. So I did, and that's basically how I started writing travel books for rough guides. And then from that, I wrote the first crime novel that I thought would make me millions. And it was featured on, do you remember Fill the Shelf? The BBC Radio Wales program? It was featured as the shelf starter on that. And an editor asked to see the whole book, and he loved it, and he sort of sat on it for a while. And eventually told me that no one, they didn't want it because no one could sell humorous crime, which horrified me because I didn't realize it was humorous. I hadn't meant it to be. So that was a little bit of a put down. And so I went, but they said, go away and write something not humorous. And so I went away and wrote about Elisenda. And that was rejected by I don't know how many agents. But then finally I got an agent, and she sent it off, and that was again rejected 30 odd times, and then finally got a publisher. And then
And it just goes to show, doesn't it?
It's perseverance.
Absolutely. I mean, somebody once told me the only difference between a successful writer and a non-successful writer is perseverance. And we all know, and we've seen so many people at crime fiction festivals who come up to us to talk to us, who say, "Oh, I've written this book and I can't get it published. I'm going to give up." And you think, okay, yeah, give up then. You're clearly not destined to be a writer.
Writers. You don't even have to look at writers, Alice. Look at Boris Johnson. I mean, that's persistence, isn't it? That's persistence.
Yeah, but he won't give up.
Oh, if only he would. If only he would. Oh dear.
No, but it's that perseverance. While you're harvesting rejections, you're actually also learning your craft.
Yeah.
And it's that perseverance, not just at keeping going in the face of rejection, but just keeping writing and writing every day, and your craft will perfect it.
Yeah, absolutely. Chippendale didn't produce a wonderful chair first time out. I'm quite sure of that. So yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's kind of drill down a little bit into this switch that you've both made from contemporary to historical. Had you both always intended to write historical crime? And if so, what made now the right time? Vas, do you want to kick us off with that?
Well, I did write a historical during that period where I was not published. But this one was an extension of the books that I was always writing. So, let me do some book flashing. So you mentioned this. So this is the first book that I finally got published, was The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra. And this came about because I, at the age of 23, got the opportunity to go and work in India. I was born in the UK. I grew up here, but my parents were originally from the subcontinent. And for me, it was as big a shock as it might be for anyone from Wales who'd never been to India before. It's a huge culture shock. And I spent 10 years there, and it's an completely different society to anything that I had known. But when you spend that much time in a place, you get to know it intimately. And so that book is really my amazing memories of an amazing place that was being transformed as India goes from this post-industrial society to the near global superpower that we think of India as today, with skyscrapers and call centers, of which I'm sure everybody in Wales has benefited at some point or another. And once I'd done that, and I'd written 5 books in that series, because of the amount of research I had carried out, I thought, well, how did this modern India come to be? And the truth of it is that the roots of this modern India were set just after partition and independence, because that, after nearly 300 years of the British being in India, firstly with the East India Company and then the 100 odd years of the Raj, India had not had control over her own destiny and her civil structures and politics and economics and all the rest of it. But in 1947, when India became independent, they had to make a decision. It became the world's largest democracy, 300 million Indians, almost as many sheep as you have in America. And at that point, Prime Minister Gandhi had been assassinated. So Nehru took over the Congress Party and became India's first prime minister. And he had to decide, what kind of democracy do I want? And he was, like Gandhi, someone who wanted a more equitable society in India, because for generations, it had been, prior even to the British, it had been ruled by kings and nawabs and emperors and feudal landowners. And he wanted to make it a slightly fairer society. So he wanted a social democracy. But he was battling against these old forces, feudal landlords and maharajas. Nobody wants to give up power, right? When you've had it for so long. So for me, this is an incredibly intriguing period. It's not really well explored in fiction, certainly not in crime fiction. And so into that period, I put India's first female police inspector, and I bumped off, this will make all the Welsh happy, I bumped off a British English diplomat in Midnight at Malabar House. That's this one, first book in that series. And Persis, then the case lands in her lap. She has to solve it. And we get to explore some of that incredible history of the British leaving, India taking over, and how the two nations and peoples were interacting post-independence.
And it is absolutely fascinating. I mean, to my horror, I realized how much I didn't know about the whole process of partition in India when I read Midnight to Malabar House. I mean, I realized that there'd been internecine bloodshed and what have you, but I had no idea of the scale of the slaughter when the British just basically upped and left. So yeah, I mean, it's...
Well, the British were like referees at a really bad-tempered boxing match or a really terrible football match because they didn't have enough people on the ground. They decided to exit very, very quickly. The person, Cyril Radcliffe, who came and drew the partition lines, cutting India into 3 pieces, he'd never been to India. He didn't know anything about it, and he was given 2 months to just chop this country into 3 pieces. And he didn't have any time to consult with anyone. He didn't want to consult with anyone. He hated being in India. He hated the Indians. He hated the malaria and the pestilence and the heat. So he just got it done as quickly as possible. And because of that, there was no orderly transfer. And, you know, it's not entirely the fault of the British because Indians, Muslims had been agitating for their own homeland. And it finally got out of hand. The rhetoric between Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs became so bad that neighbors who had lived in the same village for a century, 2 centuries, they picked up swords, they picked up torches, and they just slaughtered each other. Literally, good people like yourselves got up one day and decided to turn into bloodthirsty murderers just because you were incited by religious hatred and this jingoism, which said that, look, we've got new enemies now, and they were once our neighbors, but now they're the enemy. So yeah, the British had a hand in it, but they're not the sole culprits in the 2 million people who died and the 10 million who were displaced during that incident. And, you know, these are all things that I explore in that series because there's so much that we can learn about modern strife, that lessons that we can take from there, lessons clearly that we haven't learned, that hopefully will teach some people something.
Absolutely. And obviously it's not just in India that we've seen exactly that scenario play out. The same thing happened in Rwanda, the same thing happened in Bosnia and Serbia. It's just, it seems to be part of human nature, doesn't it? And it's just a fascinating backdrop against which to set a crime novel. And I think you did it brilliantly and quite deservedly won the Dagger last year. Hold some of those thoughts and we will come back to them. I just want to get over to Chris and see what tore you away from Elisenda and made all your fans like me wail and gnash their teeth.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oddly, curiously, a little bit like Vas. I went to live in Catalonia when I was 20, and I studied Spanish, but I didn't know anything about Catalonia, its language, its culture, its history, anything. And I went there, and then it was quite curious going from Wales, where I felt in many ways we'd lost a lot. The time I went, we'd lost a lot of our identity as Wales. And I went to Catalonia, and it was kind of a lesson in how to remember your identity in the face of adversity. And I just fell head over heels in love with the people, the language, the culture, the history, every single part of it. And that was why I wanted to write the Elisenda books, because then suddenly Barcelona became very well known and everyone heard of it and people went to visit and what have you. But people in this country didn't really know Catalonia outside Barcelona. And I wanted to write about an urban Catalonia that wasn't Barcelona. And Girona was the obvious choice because that's where I'd first gone to live in Catalonia. I lived in Girona. I only lived in Girona for 4 years. But I think that's partly why it kept its mystique for me. And I found it easy to write about. I lived in Barcelona for 16 years and I can't write about it because it's too close, I suppose. It was curious. I felt like I was able to write about Girona. And the other thing there was what was happening was that policing was devolved to a Catalan police force. And there's a very different concept of policing in Spain from what we were used to in this country at that time. And sort of the police were there it was a throwback from the Franco era. They were there to monitor, to control, to punish. And the Catalans, when they set up the police, they decided, no, we want to do things differently. And they looked to Northern Europe, they looked to Scandinavia. They actually did come to Wales and Scotland, I think. And they looked to Northern Europe, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and had a more Northern European style of policing. And that meant bringing in more graduates and more women police officers, which is why the character in those books is a woman, because that was such an unusual thing in Spain / Catalonia at that time. So that's why I write those books. And then sort of they came to an end. There was a trilogy, they came to an end. And Eddie, the Paris books, that's sort of like a jumble of things that all came together. I did my degree thesis on the French resistance and on the factions within the French resistance. And that's something that always stayed with me, the squabbling between the various factions of the French resistance. They all had a meeting in 1944, 9 different resistance groups. They all sent 2 people each, 18 people, and they ended up fighting each other. And it just, the whole rivalry between the various, not just the communists and the Gaullists, but within it, the communists fighting themselves and the Gaullists fighting themselves. And that fascinates. And then sort of learn more about history. And you realize that the Germans occupying Paris had just as many factions, just as many rivalries, the Nazis and the non-Nazis, the non-Nazi Abwehr versus the Nazi SD and Gestapo. They hated each other. And they did everything they could to undermine each other. And I think so that had sat in my mind, bubbling away for probably about 30 odd years. No, more probably, I hate to say. That had sat bubbling away. And then I started to think about how we always read about the resistance and collaboration in the war, and they're concepts that have always fascinated me because such grey areas. There are lots of books and lots of films where suddenly the day after the Germans occupied the city, everyone got out of bed that morning and blew up a train. Well, it didn't happen. There was very, very few people actively resisted. Very, very few people actively collaborated. The vast majority just tried to get by. And so my interest is in the ones that try to get by, but also in trying to get by, inevitably, there are going to come moments when you resist in some way and you collaborate in another way. If you're a waiter in a restaurant and you serve a German a cup of coffee, are you collaborating? If you don't wee in his coffee, are you collaborating? Are you resisting? And it's those ideas, and then then you find, okay, so there's a police officer who has to do his job under the occupation. How far does he resist? How far does he collaborate? What's he prepared to do to get by, to carry on doing his job, to try and see some sort of justice is done? Because that's ultimately all he has left. All he has left is to try and ensure that he can do his job and solve crimes. And he's solving mundane crimes in Paris while all around tens and hundreds of thousands of people are being slaughtered. And it's that sort of trying to understand how he might cope with that. And it was that. And then I sort of read this article about the one time that Hitler visited Paris, and that was it. That was the final click. I thought, okay, yeah, that was originally going to be the whole point of the book, that one. But in the end, it became just the final, the ending of the book. And it was that was the final piece of the jigsaw, I suppose, that made me say, right, I'm going to write the book.
Fascinating. I mean, it's really interesting how both of you have identified periods of history where things are so much influx. There's so much disagreement, intercommunal disagreement, even once things are fairly steady. Well, if things ever became steady in India post-partition, you've still got people rehashing old arguments. You've still got people massively disagreeing. And obviously the same in the war. Once the Nazis occupied Paris, like you say, you've got all spectrums of collaboration. And yet what you two have managed to do is create people who manage to rise above that. Your detectives slightly rise above that and are just like, no, this is what I'm doing. I'm doing my job. I don't care what you all think. I'm doing my job. I wanted to ask you, Vas, you described Persis Wadia as India's first female detective inspector. When did such a person actually exist, the first female detective inspector? Do you know?
About 10 years later than I've got Persis. And the reason that I put her in 1950 and not 1960 is because it's a more intriguing period. There are tens of thousands of Brits, foreigners still in the country, and I hadn't realized that. I thought all the Brits were booted out in 1947, but that's not true. Many of them stayed. Many of them knew no other life. They'd been born in India, they grew up in India. They had absolutely no intention of going back to cold, damp, wet, miserable England, where they weren't going to be served hand and foot by native servants. So they stayed on, and they usually get bumped off in that particular series. And Persis is intriguing in the sense that, you know, India is a very patriarchal society. We all know this, but it's also incredibly misogynistic in terms of its administrative and political structures. And you can imagine, and that persists till today. So you can imagine how bad it was back in 1950 and how bad it was in the police force. So as an author and as readers, hopefully, what you want is conflict with your characters facing challenges. So she enters the Bombay police force, the only woman. Nobody knows what to do with her. Nobody wants to work with a woman. So they put her in the smallest police station of Bombay, Malabar House, with all the rest of the rejects and the misfits. And, you know, so it's her job, because she's incredibly ambitious, she's intelligent, but she's also, she's one of these people whose ambition blinkers her to the social niceties. So she doesn't mind running over a few softer, squishier feelings if that's what it takes to solve the case, because she's so determined to prove that a woman can succeed in this man's world. And I think that more than anything, from readers around the world now, that's endeared her to them, because I haven't made her soft and I haven't blurred her outlines and made her a typical Indian woman who sort of tries to fit in and not cause a fuss in a male environment. She's the exact opposite of that.
Yeah, no, she is, absolutely, and we absolutely root for her. She's fantastic. You can really get behind Persis. You know, there's no sense in which you think, oh, come on, get on with it. You know, you're right there with her.
Well, I try and humanize her a little bit, because she has her own sidekick, who is an Englishman, Archie Blackfinch, and Archie's a forensic scientist who's working in India. So he's one of these Englishmen who've been invited to India to help India take over the reins. And Archie and Persis, I mean, it's a will they, won't they kind of situation. But you've got this dynamic, because good or bad, the British and Indians have shared these 3 centuries. You know, it's like a bad, sometimes abusive marriage. Even when it ends, there is that lingering shared memories. And, you know, so Archie represents that English shared experience. And Persis is this new India, you know, barreling forward at 100 miles an hour, trying to figure out the country that now belongs to them. And so I use them as props to explore nuggets of Indian history that will be of interest to people, not just Indians, but to Western audiences, particularly British audiences who have that lingering memory of the Raj.
Yeah, and you do it incredibly well. And I think you're doing yourself a disservice to call them props. I mean, that implies that they're kind of cardboard cutouts that you're moving around the scenery, and they're absolutely not that. They're properly well fleshed out characters. And I, for one, am very interested to see whether they will or whether they won't. Chris, like Persis, Eddie is very much a product of his immediate back history, the back history of his country, and obviously in his particular context that includes the First World War. Do you want to talk a bit about how the First World War has impacted on Eddie and why he is the person he is?
Yeah, well, Eddie, I mean, he went to the war quite young with 2 friends who didn't survive the war. Eddie did, and he's always had that survivor guilt. His brother was killed in the war as well, and his brother was an older brother, but who was less able to cope with life, say, than Eddie could. And the brother followed Eddie to the war and died, and Eddie's relationship with his parents because of that was always strained. Eddie was then diagnosed with shell shock, sent to Paris, and that's the first. He's from the south of France. He's from Perpignan. But he was diagnosed with shell shock and sent to Paris, where he went to a psychiatric hospital in the 5th arrondissement, which was his first experience of Paris. And when he did eventually move back to Paris as a police officer, he chose to live in the 5th arrondissement near the hospital because he felt safe there. But this is where he met and fell in love with the nurse who looked after him. He was sent back to the front much too soon, and then he was taken prisoner. He spent the rest of the war in a German prisoner of war camp, wasn't released until 1919. Or didn't get back home until 1919, and so he joined the police. It was always assumed he'd go into his parents' business. They're booksellers. Eddie's a fanatical book lover, and he was. But he decided no, he wanted to try and do something to put things right, and so he joined the police in Paris. But he had too many ghosts from the war, and his life went into free fall in the 20s. He moonlighted on the door in the jazz club, and he had a son by that stage. And he realized, again, because of his shell shock, because he was never fully recovered, that he was a danger to himself, to his wife, and to his child. And he walked out on them when the boy was 6, and never saw them again. He's always regretted. He's always been sad about it, but he's never regretted it because he felt he did the right thing for them. And so what happens at the start of this book is that his estranged son, who has now himself become a soldier in the French army on the run from the Germans in the fall of France, turns to his father for help. And so it's a sort of a very, very strained relationship between him and his son. And the son wants help from his father, but refuses to accept help and refuses to trust his father. And so, yeah, Eddie's very much a product of the First World War, of a life that went into free fall in the 1920s, and this sort of jazz age in Paris. And so he sort of, when he left his wife and child, it was to keep his head down, to try not to have problems, to carry on doing his job as a police officer. And that all is thrown out of the window when the Germans enter the city again, because it brings back so much of what he's suppressed for so long. And so and he sort of starts to realize that the only way he's actually going to survive the occupation and having to work with the Germans, because as a police officer, the Germans, the Nazis didn't send enough soldiers and police to France, so they had to rely on the French police. And this is a story that was sort of not widely told after the war, and it's only become learned more recently that the role of the French police in the occupation. And so Eddie is forced in many ways to help subdue his own people. And so this is his reaction to it, how he responds to it.
So in the book, he chooses to investigate the deaths of some Polish, I suppose we'd call them refugees now, who are found in an abandoned railway carriage. And nobody else wants those deaths investigated. It's like, why are you even bothering? Who cares? Why did you choose that particular investigation for him? Why not the death of a high-ranking Nazi or something which would get us into the German camp? Why those Polish men?
I think that there are a lot of books that deal with the occupation in Paris that are the elite. They're the high-ranking Germans. They're the high-ranking French. And I'm just far more interested in the ordinary people. Going as an aside, what was it like buying bread? Were the buses running? How did you live your normal everyday life? When did he go and buy butter before going to work? Was he able to? By the time he got to shop, was it all gone? Mm-hmm. And I think this was the whole thing. It was refugees. It was people who had nothing. They weren't high-ranking. They not in the situation they were in Paris. In Poland, where they came from, perhaps they were, but they weren't in Paris. They were unknown, nameless victims who had no one to care for them, to care what had happened to them, and to care about justice for them. And I think that's what Eddie clung to as his way of resisting. It's his form of resistance, in a way, is to do his job when both the police and the occupiers would really rather he didn't worry, really rather he just sort of buried it and let it go away. And I think that's the whole point. That's what he clings to. And it's, I mean, for all the mistakes he's made in the past, it's his form of redemption.
Yeah, no, I thought it was lovely, fascinating, and made for a very intriguing book. It wasn't, when I read The Unwanted Dead, I was constantly surprised, which was great. It's what I always love about your writing. And similarly with Dying Day, you didn't just have Persis investigating murders. You've got this theft at the beginning of the Dante manuscript from the Bombay Asiatic Society. Why that particular manuscript? And actually, was it there? Was it on loan to the Bombay Asiatic?
So this is one of those things that when you do a lot of research for historical crime, you end up finding nuggets of information. And before I tell you about the Dying Day, I'll give you a simple example which has appeared in the third book in the series. So it's Welsh related, so I feel I should say it. It's George Everest, the man after which Mount Everest is named. He's a Welshman.
Yeah.
He was born in a place called Crickhowell.
Crickhowell, yeah.
Crickhowell, yeah.
Right. Now, George Everest was a Surveyor General of India in the 1800s. So his job was to go around doing geographical stuff, surveying things, etc. But he never set foot on Everest. He had nothing to do with Mount Everest being determined as the world's highest peak. It was an Indian called Sidkar who actually used trigonometry to determine this unnamed peak that it was the world's tallest mountain. But for various reasons, to do with the fact that the Royal Geographical Society, who was in charge of naming Mount Everest, didn't want to name it after the various native names that it already had, they decided that it should be named after Everest. Now, to give him his due, he wasn't very comfortable with that honor, but they gave it to him, and that's why it's known as Mount Everest. So with The Dying Day, which is this lovely looking cover here, in that book, a 600-year-old copy of Dante's The Divine Comedy is stolen from Bombay's Asiatic Society. Both those things are real. Bombay's Asiatic Society was built by the British. It's a treasure trove of ancient artifacts and books and manuscripts. It's been around for 200 years. And the Dante manuscript is a real treasure in that, probably its most valuable treasure. Mussolini offered $1 million for it in the 1930s, and the Indian government refused. So I visited the Bombay Asiatic Society when I was living in India, and I saw these things, and it stayed with me for 2 decades before I thought, this would make a great plot if the Dante manuscript was stolen, and the person in charge of it, an Englishman named John Healy, who was the curator at the Bombay Asiatic Society, he goes missing as well. Persis investigates, bodies start to pop up, and what she discovers is a series of riddles written in verse and some various other ciphers and things. So this is one of those novels which appeals to the reader's intellectual vanity, because there are just enough clues in these riddles and these codes that someone might be able to work out, if not all of the answer, some of the answers, and gradually Persis follows the bodies and the clues to find the manuscript, obviously, but to find out also who the killers of these various corpses laying in its path are.
Great, thank you. Yeah, those historical nuggets, yes. I mean, we've all got them, haven't we? As historical crime writers, it's like, I've got to put that in a book. Gosh, yes, I've got a whole file full of them. You go on, Chris.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say how Vass has so beautifully described the power of historical fiction. It's what you were saying about Partition. I knew extremely little about Partition. Your book, your first book with the Rebecca riots, I knew something, but not a great deal. But reading your books has taught me a huge amount that I didn't know. Quite apart from being brilliant, entertaining, fabulous novels and crime stories, they taught me a huge amount of things that I didn't know, that sent me off on my own little path to find out more. And I think that is the power of historical fiction, historical crime fiction.
Well, it's never been more popular. If you look at the numbers, the people reading historical fiction, people listening to historical podcasts, it's never been more popular. And I think with historical crime fiction, when readers spend £8 or £10 or whatever it costs them, you know, what we're hopefully delivering is, you know, a good crime story, obviously, great characters they want to spend time with, great settings, whether it's, you know, location-wise and also period-wise, but also this lesson told in a nice way, the canvas that these murder mysteries are happening against. And I for one, I know when I read, because I was one of the first people to read the Eddie Giral, The Unwanted Dead, and you know, as soon as I finished reading it, I thought that was a great historical novel. I've learned so much that I didn't know about this period, and you know, which is why I wrote to you. And I thought,
yeah, thank you. That was one of the loveliest moments, actually, in your email. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful reading it.
No, that's great, brilliant. Vas, you have a really interesting blog on your website, which is about interesting facts from Indian history, and some of those, it seems to me, would make great starting points for novels. Are any of those going to actually make their way?
Well, yeah, I've been embarked on this project for over a year now. I'm writing 50 pieces going all the way from ancient India to modern India. And they're just articles. I do some research, I write an article, and people seem to enjoy them. They're just freely available on my website if anybody's interested, vaseemkhan.com. But again, it goes back to those nuggets of information that you discover. I mean, another thing that really made me laugh, given that we're talking about the World War II. So Joseph Stalin, he once asked, you know, how was it that so few Brits could rule over hundreds of millions of Indians? And the answer was something called the steel frame of the empire. And that refers to the Indian civil service, which is the bureaucratic institution that the British set up. And, you know, I'm convinced that the reason that Gandhi finally, the straw that broke the camel's back, and the reason that he undertook his revolutionary activities was not just because of his belief in the inherent evils of empire and colonialism, but because he was asked to fill out one form in triplicate too many, which is, you know, literally what Indians had to do for the smallest thing. The British were wonderful, wonderful record keepers in India, which is why we have so much history, right from the East India Company. And partly it was self-interest, because they were trying to figure out what they could tax and how much they could squeeze out of the country. But so they kept meticulous records, which now form the basis of the history that we can now draw upon, whether you're historians or historical writers, as we are talking about India. So yeah, it's wonderful to be able to dig into that.
I know, fascinating. And as historical crime writers, I think probably the thing we find most difficult is stopping the research and getting on with the writing. So speaking of stopping, I'm very aware that people will be champing at the bit to have their questions answered. But before we do that, in honour of Vas, who I know from listening to the Red Hot Chili Writers podcast loves a quiz, I have 3 questions for each of you, which you should know the answers to if you've been paying attention. You'll have 1 minute each to answer the 3 questions. And I'm going to ask our producer, Jamie, if he will start playing the clock countdown. Can we have the clock countdown? Is there going to be a sound effect? There is not going to be a sound effect. It's playing. No, we can't hear it, Jamie. Don't worry. So I'll just have to do it without the scary sound effects. Apologies to everybody who was expecting the scary sound effects. OK. Vas, yours first. Name the as yet unpublished second book in the Eddie Giral series.
Oh God, I don't know the answer to this. Eddie Giral 2, Eddie Giral the sequel, Eddie Giral and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Eddie Does Dallas.
That's it.
Sorry, I don't know.
Excellent.
Eddie Giral 2 was the working title for 8.
I don't think Chris has sent it to me.
Chris, send it to him instantly.
It's not. We haven't got advanced copies yet or anything.
It's not my fault. I get that point. It's not my fault.
I'm getting it when you get it, Vaz. I've got dibs on it. It's called Paris Requiem. Okay, next question. What is the nationality of the men found dead in the abandoned railway carriage in The Unwanted Dead?
Mongolian, Inuit.
I thought you were going to say Indian.
Are they gender neutral, gender fluid citizens of the world?
They're
Polish.
remembered.
They're Polish.
You've just improved it.
Yeah, absolutely. See,
No
I hope
problem.
you're taking notes, Chris, because these are all good things for the next book. Okay, last one.
I'm taking notes.
You totally should be. Vas, what's the main character in Chris's earlier Catalonian crime thriller series? What's her name?
Boris Johnson, Vladimir Putin,
Borisina.
Alexander.
Alexander, that's it.
Elisenda Domènech. I've learned to say it in the proper Catalan way. Okay, excellent. Very, very amusing from Vas there. Chris, here are your three.
Oh, Lord.
Name Vas's first Persis book.
Oh, that's the one set in Wales. Midnight at Machantla's house.
Excellent. That's the one. I'm not even going to correct that. That's good. In The Dying Day, what famous manuscript was stolen?
It's a copy of the Dandy.
Ah, yes, very good.
Which is a divine comic.
Dandy.
Gandhi loved the Dandy.
Oh, did he?
Oh, no, I'm just...
Really?
It rhymes. So I just made
Gandhi, I love the Dandy. Excellent. Okay, and the last one for you, Chris. Name the inspector and his baby elephant that appear in Vas's earlier series.
I'm drawing the line there. That's the Chopmeister.
The Chopmeister.
That's Inspector Chop. No one messes with Baby Ganesh.
Excellent. Excellent.
Named after my brother-in-law.
Really? Really?
Ashwin Chopra is my brother-in-law.
Oh, I thought it was Ganesh.
Okay.
Oh, no, not yet.
I thought his name was Baby Ganesh.
No,
Yeah, I got the wrong end of the stick there.
My brother-in-law is not an elephant. No, he's a bit overweight. He's a bit overweight, but that's cruel, Alice.
sorry. I take it all back. I take it back versus his brother-in-law. Okay, maybe that's the right note upon which to call Louise over from YouTube Fastnesses. Hi, Louise.
Hello, hi. Right, apologies. Apparently the apocalypse is starting in Cardiff because there are power shortages on my street.
Oh no.
So occasionally my lights flicker really quite dramatically and I might cut out, but I'm fine. I have not been swallowed by the hellmouth. Okay, so
that was good. No zombie apocalypse yet.
We have lots of questions from people. People have been loving your chat. It's been really, really interesting. And the first one is from Alex, and this is to Chris in particular. As a former travel writer, is there anywhere that you have not written about as a historical writer that you would be planning to write about next? Where would you like to go next?
That's a really nice question. I suppose really I ought to write about Catalonia historically, because I've only ever written about the present day. And there are sort of events in Catalan history going back that I would love to write. There's the Semana Trágica, which was the sort of anarchists basically going wild in Barcelona at the turn of the century, which I think would be a wonderful story to write. Yeah, I'd probably be very cowardly and stick to the Catalonia that I know. That's very lazy, I'm sorry. But there are all sorts of things going back through history and sort of even sort of more recent, sort of the transition. So when Franco died in 1975 and all the sorts of weird and wonderful things going on then. Yeah, that would be interesting. Alex, nice idea. Thank you.
He's very good, Alex. He's been brilliant on the question.
Lovely, yeah.
Actually.
Thank you.
Now, this question is for both of you, and it's kind of carrying on a little bit. This is one of my questions that I want to just add in, because Alice touched on this just at the end. How much, or how difficult is the balance between your historical research and moving the plot along? You know, how do you walk that fine line between not just becoming a history textbook?
Chris?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's sort of, yeah, because we're writing sort of fact and fiction, aren't we? And you sort of have to observe the fact and respect the fact, but not let it get in the way of writing the fiction. And it's very easy to fall into that trap because you want to sort of, oh, I know that, I'm going to add that, and people will be terribly impressed with me. But then you sort of come to it after in the edit and you think, oh, that's so awful, get rid of it. So yeah, it's the research, as Alice says, the research is a rabbit hole. You can go down it for months. And I set myself a block of 2 months and said, right, at the end of 2 months, you then start writing the book. And I researched solidly for 2 months, sat down to write the book. And the first paragraph, there were 2 things I needed to go and research, which took me the whole day. And so yes, the research for the sake of your story is something, boy, do you really have to put in its place. because otherwise I end up being put in my place by the research and forgetting to write.
I think readers very quickly let you know if
Yeah.
they're happy with, things are getting bogged down. So with experience, you learn that you've got to chop out a lot of stuff that you initially put in your first draft because it's not helping the story. It's showing off. It's not necessary. But having said that, a lot of the enjoyment of historical crime comes from the fact that you season the plot with these elements from history, and readers appreciate being informed about these sorts of things. And if you do it with a light hand, it's almost seamless.
Yeah.
And I think that's the trick. At any point in time, if you dip into my book or Chris's books or Alice's books, you should be able to follow where the plot has gotten up to in terms of solving this murder or whatever the crime happens to be. The clues are the main things that are dotted through the novel, and you wrap a bit of history around each of those points within the novel.
Now, Chris has kind of answered this second question. It's from Gwyneth. Third question even, I can't count, sorry. And it is, she says that history is written by the victor. So how do you as a writer choose a side? I think Vaseem, you didn't really get a chance to talk about, which side to you is the most interesting. Is it the victor who often gets to write history, or the ones who often don't have a voice?
Well, I mean, given that I grew up in Britain, so I'm British to all intents and purposes, but having lived in India and having my parents' history to draw upon, it's very difficult to find that balance. Now, hopefully I've done it because, a lot of the characters that you see in my novels, not just the ones that get killed off, but the ones that actually actively participate, are white characters. They're English, they're Scottish. There's a Welsh one in the fourth book that I'm writing. So part of what I'm trying to do is to give a balanced perspective, because it's easy for me, it would have been easy for me to just paint the Brits as villains because of the Raj. And we all know colonialism is bad. But many Brits went to India with the best of intentions. They went on what they thought was a civilizing mission to help people who they felt were not as advanced as they were, to give them a religion they felt was going to save their souls. And bearing in mind that they already had 30 million gods, that's a lot of work for missionaries that went out there. So I try and present both of those perspectives, because the Indians weren't saints. The partition, as I've mentioned already today, it was, a lot of it was fueled by religious hatred, and caste prejudice, for instance, is a huge problem in India to this day, and that's amongst the Hindu religion, where people at the top, they treat people at the bottom of the caste system incredibly badly. So for me, it's about a balanced perspective.
Thank you. We also have a question from his moniker is Grumpy Old Books. Now, I know he has a different name, but I'm just going to refer to him as Mr. Grumpy. And Mr. Grumpy, this is aiming a question for you, Chris. This is about Eddie. He is described as a rough, kind of brutal working class guy. Did you ever think about making your protagonist more middle class, perhaps more cerebral? And the example he's given is Harry Probert, like Harry Probert.
Oh, right. No, I think I wanted Eddie rough and ready all the way, because I mean, it's funny, you sort of write stories set in Paris and you think, oh, well, it's got to be very refined and very this, that, and very cultured and what have you. And Eddie is cultured. He's a very well-read man, but he's from southern France. He's not from a very wealthy community or a very wealthy family, and he's kind of rough and ready, and he's been made even rougher and readier thanks to his experiences in the First World War. And I just found that more interesting, how that would rub up against the sort of the higher echelons of the Nazis, against the character like Hochstetter, the German major who is sort of assigned to work with Eddie. And I just find that sort of Eddie's rough edges make him a more interesting character to write and to explore his reactions to the events around him. So yeah, nice question though. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that actually.
Mr. Grumpy thinks of good questions. And then we've also got one next for you, Chris, as well, which is from Karen. Oh, no, it's not from Karen. Sorry, I lie. It's from Winnie. And she was asking if your book is going to be translated into French, and in particular, how interesting that would be for readers to read about that part of history, which was a difficult period, obviously, for them.
Yeah, I haven't, I don't know anything about it being translated in French. Oddly, the first language it was translated into was German, which was incredibly, I was very, very moved by it, actually, because I thought, you know, sort of in Germany, they've really embraced their history. They've faced up to it. They've confronted in a way that sort of Bass's books about colonialism, we often haven't in this country faced up to our own history. And so I was sort of very, very touched that Germany was the first country to buy it. But no, I've heard nothing from France at all. I just heard today that the second book is probably going to be published in Spanish, which is rather nice because the first book is in Spanish as well. So it's sort of quite curious the countries that do buy the book. They'd be about to say, yeah, the French have sort of gone.
Because Macron's too busy winning the election.
He is.
Or sitting with his shirt undone, lounging very in a masculine way on the sofa. He's too busy having his photo shoot for the...
You are talking about Macron now, not me, I take it.
No, you're gold lame, Chris. It's okay. We know exactly what you prefer to wear. And just to finish off, because you started talking about rejection right at the start, and I wondered if any of you, including Alice, if you had any tips for writers, budding and published writers who are currently dealing with rejection right now, because it's obviously a massive part of the writing journey. Oh, no.
You send it, don't send it out too soon. I did that. I sent one book out far too soon. It wasn't ready. And you find that agents don't give you a second chance. So they might say, we like your writing, but go away. It's quite odd. They won't say, oh, we'll work on it and send it back. That never happened in my experience. So work on it. Don't send it too soon. Hold on to it, put it in a drawer for 2 months, come back to it, work on it again. Don't overwork it, but get it right. Try and get it as best you can, which will give them the fewest opportunities to turn you down. If they follow their guidelines, and if they say they want 3 chapters, send 3 chapters, but be canny and end your 3rd chapter on one hell of a cliffhanger that they want to then read. And in my experience as well, try experienced agents and agents just starting out. They're often more willing to take on new authors. So yeah, in a nutshell, those are my my advice.
Vaseem?
Well, the only appropriate response in such a situation is to go around the offices of the agents who rejected you and throw a stone through the window and then run away. No, look, the best thing to do is to remember that agents are not your enemies. They only make money if they can get a good book and sell that good book. They're always on the lookout for something they love and can fall in love with, and then they can sell. So what's important to them is the first 5 to 10 pages. You know, if you've got a brilliant 30-page submission, but all the good stuff is in the last 20 pages, that's not going to help, because they might not even get to page 10 because they get so many submissions. Sometimes the first 5 pages can put them off. If nothing's happening, the story's not moving, it's not very well written. So put all of your good stuff in the first 5 pages.
Yeah.
And Alice?
Or 2 things. One is read your work out loud to yourself, because when you do that, you will hear things that don't work, and you will also hear when it gets very dull, because you'll think, oh, I've been reading this chapter for ages and it doesn't work. And the second thing is ask yourself and be really honest, what makes my book different to all the others on the slush pile? And if there's nothing that's going to raise it out of the herd, don't send it. You've got to have something which the agent at the end of the day can think, that book that I started reading this morning, I want to go back and read that because that had something that I've not seen before or for a long time.
You can't put a baby elephant in it because that's all.
Yes, Vass has got that one.
And leave World War II Paris alone. That's mine.
And you can't have West Wales in the 19th century, sorry.
Oh gosh, there's a lot of stuff off limits now. Right, I will duck out, and Alice, I will leave you to finish the panel. Thank you for a really, really good chat. We've really enjoyed it over in the comment section.
Good.
Thanks, Louise.
Thanks, Louise. Louise is always brilliant value when it comes to not just reading out the questions, but interpreting the questions. So that's great. And we've overrun, but I hope everybody will forgive us, because that's just been so fascinating. I could talk to Chris and Vass for the rest of the night, and that's not a joke. It only remains for me now to thank Vaseem and Chris for a fantastically entertaining and educational panel, and to you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and that you'll sign up for other Gwyl Crime Cymru Festival events. Meanwhile, good night and take care. Noswaith dda i chi gyd.